Welcome to this episode of the Viking Virtual Resident Historian. It's part of our ongoing cultural enrichment program and our commitment to destination-focused learning. A series that takes you further with unique perspectives and intriguing insights. It analyzes and puts into context important chapters of world history. The Viking Virtual Resident Historian puts history at your fingertips. We hope you'll find this episode enriching.
Hello, and welcome to another Viking Iconic Lecture. My name is Charles Doherty, and today's lecture we're going to look at the Roman Empire, thinking about how for over 1,000 years the Romans managed to maintain, control, and leave their imprint on much of Western Europe and the Mediterranean region. Today's lecture we're going to think about three different aspects about what it meant to be Roman, how the Romans happened to maintain not only vast territory through their roads, engineering prowess, let alone their excellence in working with different civic structures and maintaining the population, keeping them happy. So what it meant to be Roman, how they happened to control their empire, but also we'll have to consider how things started to unravel and where things started to go wrong. I'm going to share with you three different well-known phrases familiar to all of you. First of all roads lead to Rome. Second of all, when in Rome, do as the Romans. And third, Rome wasn't built in a day. Please remember these three phrases as we think about how Roman engineering and infrastructure allowed for control of the empire. Think about Roman customs and manners and how they were so important during the times of the Roman dominance in Western Europe. But lastly, thinking and remembering the chronology. Rome certainly wasn't built in a day. It might be easier to start with a roadmap, helping us navigate the various chapters of Roman history. More specifically, we need to put the Roman period into some sort of historical context, from around the 8th century BC all the way up to the 5th century AD. Then we're going to consider both the infrastructure and engineering prowess of the Romans, how they were able to maintain the vast nature of their Roman territory, before we turn to the subject of daily life, everything from the child to the businessman trader to that of a soldier or a gladiator, an architect or sculptor, before we consider really when things started to unravel and why. So we need to consider the Romans in the historical context of the Mediterranean basin. What life was like before the year 500 BC. The blue line illustrates the years 3500 BC on the left all the way to 500 AD on the right, comprising some 4,000 years of history, and we know that the mint green color on your left represents Mesopotamia, from the years approximately 3500 BC to 2000. This is contemporaneous for many of these centuries with ancient Egypt, represented in pink. Note ancient Greece in green, representing the years 800 to 330 BC, and then beneath that, in lavender, ancient Rome. This is about context, appreciating the fact that the Mesopotamian and Egyptian cultures were so much earlier than ancient Greece and Rome. For thousands of years, Mediterranean civilizations were percolating and developing, and again, it will be the Romans who will profit and acquire information and knowledge from these earlier Mediterranean civilizations. Furthering our investigation of historical context and understanding the chronology of ancient Rome, we need to divide Roman chronology into three important eras. As you see, the Roman kingdom from the Roman Republic, differentiated from the Roman Empire at the bottom. For our purposes, I think you can appreciate the fact that the Roman Empire really only spans 1/3 of this period of over 1,000 years of Roman power and excellence in Western Europe. The historical context is further demonstrated when we look at geography. Looking at this map, which embraces aspects of most of Western Europe, let alone the north coast of Africa and the Middle East, this represents the height of the Roman Empire by virtue of the green and mustard colors that you see here on the map. From that northernmost point of England near the Scottish border to the portions of North Africa, areas of modern-day Spain and Portugal, across the north coast of Africa, including parts of modern-day Egypt, as well as Asia Minor. The Roman Empire was vast and important, and unlike anything else in the Mediterranean region before. How do we know about the Romans? There are a variety of different means of understanding and appreciating the historical record that they left for us, largely in stone. Remember, paper, invented in China, hadn't reached Western Europe during the Roman era. So we find chiseled in stone, sometimes on those architectural arches like the one you see in the lower right of your screen, we find a record of military conquests and battles, sometimes told pictorially in sculpture relief, other times actually chiseled in Latin. Don't forget, Latin is such an important means for our understanding of the Roman period. Printed books. And I include this because we know the interest of the Renaissance to then reprint and translate various documents from ancient Rome. And so the Renaissance period will be an important conduit for our appreciation of that Greco-Roman world. But as well, we have the stories of Greek and Roman myths and legends, relics left in tombs, what they value as luxury objects they would want in the afterlife. And so consider, for example, glassware that you see there in the image in the lower portion. How glass, hand-blown glass, and the techniques of glass will be refined, particularly up until the 1st century AD. And we know that glasswork is found in various excavation sites throughout the Mediterranean world. We also know that Romans happened to be the first to use glass in picture windows for window frames. So we have a variety of ways to then get under the surface to appreciate not only what it meant to be Roman, but as well something about their prowess and excellence in so many different arenas of art, architecture, governance, let alone engineering and infrastructure projects. Another dimension of historical context is to consider the Etruscans, an important civilization that existed in Italy, let's say between the 8th century and the 4th century BC. The Etruscans were keen traders, and we know this by the various relics that were left in their tombs. Notice the sarcophagus in the upper right-hand corner. Ones like these were richly embellished with not only aspects of the archaic Greek world, various objects that would have been traded, but as well aspects of the Phoenicians, other important mariners of the Mediterranean basin. And that pictorial representation from a tomb painting in the lower right-hand corner demonstrates it was a lively, celebratory, life-giving aspect to their life that they included in their afterlife interests. I also wanted to mention that we don't know much about the Etruscans as their language hasn't been fully deciphered, and much of the history, their history, is written by those who conquered them, the Romans. In considering historical context, we need to move from the Etruscans to the ancient Greeks. As you can see on the map, the Greek Empire to the east of Rome was much more of an Eastern-oriented progress. The territorial expansion went to the east, unlike the Roman interests, which were largely to the north and to the west. As you probably realize, without Greece, Rome would not have existed, and we see this in so many different ways. Let's take architecture and urban planning for starters. In the lower left-hand corner of your screen, you see the Greek agora, which would have been the footprint for developing and expanding various urban plans in the Roman Empire. Not just the plans, but as well the architectural design. You can picture in your mind the Greek temple, and there's an example there in the lower right-hand portion of your screen of the Parthenon. So the Greek temple design, with its columns and capitals and mathematical precision of how to ideally represent a temple to be the abode of the gods, will be then borrowed and acquired by the ancient Romans and applied for purposes of civic structures, which we'll see in a few minutes. But it's not just urban design. It's not just the architectural design, but also portrayals of the human figure. And included in the upper left-hand portion of your screen, a Greek god, a sculpture that would be mathematically precise in the proportions of how many heads in relation to the size of the body. And we know that the Romans will then use the images of the Greek gods to portray themselves, more specifically the emperors, offering grandeur and importance and power, almost like being godlike, but yet having the identifiable individual heads of a Roman emperor. Similarly, Roman interest in theater. You see the example of the outdoor theater at Epidaurus in your upper right-hand portion of the screen. And similarly, the Romans will be interested in having venues, outdoor theaters, that will accommodate the masses to entertain them. Having placed the Romans in some form of historical context allows us now to proceed to the next important question. What was it about ancient Rome that allowed it to succeed and expand far greater reaches than other Mediterranean civilizations? And I think the answers to that question may lie not only in her institutions, but as well as engineering and infrastructure prowess, allowing the Roman Empire to expand and succeed beyond anything that had existed in the region before. Let's turn to the subject of institutions. And this view of Rome that's provided for us as a model gives some inkling of this harmonious whole, a city design that allowed for the commingling of various institutions to work harmoniously, institutions that would be from branches of military and government and law courts, let alone entertainment venues, and a population that cared for its people, eventually adding places for both leisure and worship, along with venues for bathing and sports, let alone theaters and the like, would all contribute to this inkling of a harmonious whole. So this model represents really the confidence of the ancient Roman Empire, having a wide variety of buildings of various shapes and sizes that would have been built and rebuilt and oftentimes built on top of one another over the course of some 1,000 years. Let's turn to one of these important institutions, the Roman Forum. All of Rome's political, social, legislative, and even commercial history will revolve around the Forum, this once low-lying, swampy area between the Palatine and Capitoline hills. For our purposes, we need to look at how the Forum served two roles, one mythic and one real. The mythic first. It's believed that this was the area where the warring tribes laid down their arms under Romulus and Remus, the twin brothers who are supposedly credited with the founding of the Roman kingdom. Many of you remember that Romulus killed his brother Remus and purportedly went on to found many Roman institutions, including the military, as well as establishing many religious traditions. Scholars still debate the accuracy of the myth and how to ascribe truth to this figure known as King Romulus, who appears in the historical record as early as the 3rd century BC. But that's the mythic. Let's turn to the real. And we know that this swampy area was drained by an Etruscan king around 600 BC, and this then led to its development as a city center. Let's go to the map on the left. You can see the red markings that correspond to buildings that were built during the Republican era, let's say of the 6th to the 1st centuries BC. Notice also buildings in black. These denote those of the imperial era, so these would have been after 27 BC. I hope you can see that buildings were built on top of one another. And I hope you can also see that starting out as a marketplace, it became the hub of all public life, operations central, if you will, for business activity and the focal point for legislative bodies as well. In the lower right, you see a photograph of the Roman Forum today. But imagine what it would have looked like in the late imperial period, as you see represented in the upper right. The buildings are larger and more grand, and represent the various reigns of those emperors. One of the important legislative bodies at the Forum was the Roman Senate, home to the Curia that you see represented on the right. This was a meeting place and a repository for executive power where the Roman Senate passed laws. Beginning in the day of King Romulus, there were 100 nobles that were chosen, as the story goes, to essentially represent the king's council and serve as a legislative body. But at its height, that Senate would expand to 500 senators. Rome, however, was never a true democracy. After the fall of the monarchy in 509 BC, the Roman Republic, which replaced it, was ruled by patricians, and these were the descendants of the great families. Opposite them was the plebeian class, however, that provided the great manpower for the military. The Roman Republic would collapse in 27 BC, moving from a limited form of democracy to the new totalitarian regime that we all know as the Roman Empire. Another important institution is the military. Appreciating the chronological evolution of Roman history requires understanding of the central role of the military. You see a list of major Roman wars. For example, the Etruscan neighbors who were fought off in 3 different wars before finally pacified in the 5th century BC. Then they were essentially immersed within the fabric of the Roman Republic. The Punic Wars against the Phoenician city of Carthage, which were some of the bloodiest battles ever experienced in warfare, and those wars outside of modern-day Tunis in Tunisia. There were also wars to the north with both Germanic tribes and the Gauls. Also note the conquest of Britain that came later, not until the 1st century AD. Shown in the upper right, the familiar Hadrian's Wall, I mentioned earlier, in the uppermost part of England near the Scottish border, remains the largest Roman artifact anywhere, stretching some 73 miles across northern England, built during the reign of Hadrian in the early 2nd century AD. Shown in the lower right, a ground plan for a military hospital. After all, with so many troops dispatched to conquer and defend the far-reaching Roman territories, one needed military hospitals as outposts. This ground plan here dates from the 1st century AD. Once more, the Roman military's ability to command and maintain control within its territorial borders is central to understanding how the Romans were so effective for so many centuries. Another Roman institution of sorts are the major rulers. Many of these names you recognize, from Julius Caesar to Augustus to Claudius to Nero to Trajan to Constantine. Their profiles and their stories form the basis of Edward Gibbon's classic study of the 18th century History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, a lengthy study, some 6 volumes in length, from the 1770s and 80s. We know from his stories and the record from some of the other emperors that these men will be successful in conquering foreign lands, and we'll also note later on they will overreach their capacities to maintain such large territories. And we'll note eventually conflict and corruption will undermine both Roman structures and institutions at home, but also throughout the territories. Our list, I might mention, includes Julius Caesar here, who ruled during the Roman Republican era, prior to the establishment of the Roman Empire. Emperor Augustus, who you see there in the center, was the first of a series of those emperors who would control Rome after 27 BC. We've considered Roman institutions and how important they were for the expansion of the Roman Empire. More specifically, we looked at the military and its role, and the vital role it played in not only expanding the empire, but as well maintaining territorial holdings. But we must turn to the subject of infrastructure, and there's no better place to start than looking at roads, Roman roads, a network that you see here expanding some 50,000 miles from various parts of Western Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, begun as early as 300 BC. We all know about Roman roads as being so important for maintaining the empire. Let's turn to the illustration in the lower right, which provides a diagram of how Roman roads were constructed. There were 4 feet of layered materials, a combination of dirt, compacted sand, gravel granite, and lava brick. The Latin word stratum means layer, and from that word stratum, in so many Western European languages, we have the word strada or street. We see this in Italian strada, in English street, in German Strasse, in Dutch Straat. So the important aspect of Roman layering as part of the Roman road design lends itself linguistically as well to so many different Western languages. The names for the significant Roman roads might be grouped into 3 separate categories. They might be named after a council, as in the Appian Way or Via Appia. They may be named after a destination, such as Via Ostenzia, as in connecting Rome with ancient Ostia. Also, they could be named for a particular use. Via Salaria, that connected Rome with the port at Salario, or another of these, Via Triunfale, regarding use of a particular bridge, Ponte Triunfale, near Rome. So why were roads and road building so important? You can well imagine that the need for rapid reaction to deploy military forces to these outlying areas of the territories, the roads were critical for maintaining the movement of troops across great distances. In the upper right, notice a carriage. And there were many different designs of carriages, some open, some closed. Some were more luxurious than others. This one here perhaps would have been used for women and perhaps officials. But the mainstay of the design of carriages, whether they had open tops or closed, was the standardization of the wheel spacing and the axle width, meaning that the ruts in the Roman roads were grooved with the same pattern or width of track. Thus, those who attempted to ride the roads without the standardized wheel-axle ratio of their carriages meant instant destruction of their wheels. In considering Roman infrastructure, we need to address their prowess in the areas of engineering, not just roads, but many other accomplishments. Concrete, for example, was in use earlier, with the Greeks perfecting it with the addition of lime, but Romans who will really exploit its uses for the creation of everything from arches for aqueducts or ceremonial arches, bridges, let alone in the design of barrel vaults for these large civic projects. The arch is a key component, as you can see, and it will also be utilized then not only for the barrel vault, that second image in the lower register, but when you essentially intersect 2 barrel vaults at 90 degrees, you get a groin vault, demonstrated in the third image from the left. The groin vault will allow for even higher barrel vaults to soar. Water transportation is in early evidence in many parts of Mesopotamia, many parts of ancient Egypt, but the Romans will advance the idea of transporting water, taking it to new heights. For example, in aqueducts, like in the upper left-hand corner, where the Pont de Garde moves water some 60 miles from its source in Provence. Visitors to Rome today might regularly visit Trevi Fountain, which is still supplied with water by one of those 11 ancient Roman aqueducts still in use today. Sewers and sanitation. The Romans learned about the principles of sewers from the Etruscans, who built the first Roman sewer system, by the way, early as probably the 8th century BC. But the Romans will further develop the series of latrines. You see in the lower right-hand corner, these marble benches with holes that would have once had wooden planks across the top. These are definitely public restrooms, as you can imagine, or water closets. There's really no suggestion of privacy. Having established the historical context for the importance of the Roman Empire, and as well looked at the various institutions and infrastructure projects which allowed the Romans to maintain their vast empire, we turn to the subject of daily life. And what we're going to do is look at 6 different profiles: the life of a child, the life of a businessman trader, the life of a gladiator, the life of a slave, the life of an architect or sculptor, all making their contributions to the daily life of Rome. Turning to an examination of the daily life of Romans, we might begin with the life of a child. In the early years, one's education began in the home, with a father or senior member of the family serving as a teacher. But we'll find later in the Roman Republic and early imperial periods, more Greek teaching methods and the principles of tutors and schools will take place. If a child were from a wealthy family, that Greek tutor would serve a valuable role in teaching one about the Greco-Roman world. Older students would even be sent to Greece for advanced learning. Julius Caesar, for example, was sent to the Greek island of Rhodes for his advanced studies. In considering the daily life of Romans, we need to turn our attention to that of the businessman, the trader, who was part of the vital organ of moving goods in and out of the Roman Empire. The Romans were great traders, not only with those from lands they conquered, but as well lands beyond their borders, as I hope the map demonstrates. Sophisticated trade routes linked the Mediterranean with the old Silk Road and all of those luxury goods from the Near and Far East that may have traveled on the back of a camel, reaching old Constantinople, and then again eventually reaching various ports in the Roman Empire. Things from the East that were imported, not just silk and spices, but as well cottons and perfume, frankincense and myrrh, dyes from the Middle East, let alone from the North, things like silver and tin, copper, and of course wool. We can't forget, with the nature of the agriculturally based economy, the fact that wine was very important as an export. And you can see in the upper right an image of transport of wine along various river and sea routes. This was a much safer and easier means of moving wine than over the course of what may have been rather bumpy Roman roads. Once more, Roman glassware, which appears throughout the Middle East in various ports with whom the Romans traded. Glass was important not only for utilitarian purposes, but would eventually make its way into the category of luxury goods. And these expensive luxury goods would be traded extensively. We mustn't forget the daily life of another key member of the Roman community, that being the slave. Fundamentally important for the Roman economy, as slaves made up 40% of the Italian population. They were brought in from all portions of the empire, sometimes captured in battle, other times sent to Rome, and 1/2 of all the slaves worked in agriculture, the cornerstone of the Roman economy. You might ask, how were the other half of all Roman slaves employed? And let me mention, for example, an extensive Roman villa might employ hundreds of slaves to perform various daily tasks, like the women on the far left doing the laundry, while other slaves would serve in various esteemed positions, professions such as tutors or doctors or secretaries to the nobility. So slaves were much more important than just doing the laundry or working in the fields. Freedom might be obtained, but it was a complex procedure, and some would eventually become citizens with the right to vote. Having focused on the daily lives of different people working in Rome, we need to consider a dimension of fun, and more specifically, the role of the gladiator in providing fun for the masses in the Colosseum and other large venues with large throngs of screaming people, maybe 50,000 people, welcoming the arrival of the gladiators to their stage. These provided free public entertainment, and they were really at the heart of imperial Rome. Or as the ancient writer Juvenal described life in the 1st century AD, it was one of bread and circuses. Essentially, these gladiatorial arenas filled as a means to appease the general populace. If you fed them and if you entertained them, all was well in the Roman Empire. The Colosseum, for example, could hold some 50,000 spectators for these animal or gladiatorial contests. Women and the poor would have been in the upper registers of the Colosseum. Beneath would have been various senators and magistrates, and then the emperor or the emperor's family close to the ring. A gladiator often fought to death, but if the emperor were in attendance, he could offer up the gesture thumbs up for life to be spared, or as well thumbs down, certain death for the gladiator. The life of the gladiator, many of them were often slaves or criminals. Eventually, gladiatorial schools were set up to train or lure those testosterone-laden males for some of the thrill of the contest and the fame of the combat. However, it wasn't just men. Some women eventually were trained as gladiators until their participation was forbidden in the 2nd century AD by Emperor Septim Severus. Gladiatorial fights began with the Etruscans, who believed with the sacrifice of both man and animal, one was able to appease the dead. But with the Romans adopting the gladiatorial contests, there were no longer any of these earlier religious components. Not only were there gladiatorial contests, but as well contests with wild beasts. Thousands of bellowing animals ranging from leopards and bears, tigers and lions, even giraffes, camels and deer. And many of these were exotic animals from distant reaches of the Roman Empire or beyond. The animals would be taunted before being slaughtered, and it's an estimate by one historian that as many as 5,000 animals might lose their life in a single day. Of course, there were records of religious people, including Christians, who were regarded as alien troublemakers with strange rites, and stories of Christians eaten by half-starved lions, or others buried alive, or perhaps shot with arrows or hacked by swords. During the reign of Diocletian, some 3,000 martyrs are said to have lost their lives. But Christianity wasn't suppressed, and it continued to attract worshippers, and much of the population and the attraction to the movement probably attracted the attention of Constantine, who would eventually declare Christianity the official religion. The Roman baths were an important center of leisure and many related activities beyond just washing and bathing. They were elaborate community centers to entertain the masses. Take, for example, the Baths of Caracalla, shown in the far left. Note the sheer scale of its dome when comparing the size of the human beings below that center arch. The Baths of Caracalla could accommodate up to 3,000 bathers at one time. There were different rooms for relaxation and socializing, so it was more like a modern spa than a bathhouse. Note the elaborate ground plan for the baths at Pompeii on the right. There were 2 libraries, one for works in Latin and one for works in Greek. There were different types of baths, for example, very hot water, from tepid or to very cold, along with different rooms for relaxation and socializing. Traditionally, there were separate entrances to the baths, one for men, one for women, one for slaves. Also, the earliest baths would have had segregated areas for men and women, but after the 1st century AD, mixed bathing occurred. Keep this in mind as we confront the rise of Christianity and a much more prudish view of the roles of men and women in society. Lastly, note the stairgill shown in the upper center, a scraper in the form of a long, slender scoop with a handle used by athletes and bathers to remove both dust and oil from one's skin. The wealthy would have had their slaves use the stairgill to clean their backs, for example. These had been found in tombs as offerings for the deceased, so their role in life was certainly important in the afterlife. In the lower center, notice a mosaic advertising the directions toward the baths. You can see the 3 stairgills on the inside of the circle, along with a Roman style of flip-flop, sandals for the baths. One can only imagine athlete's foot as a problem some 2,000 years ago if the baths accommodated 3,000 visitors per day. One of the most important figures in the Roman Empire is undoubtedly the architect, whose buildings still grace various parts of the Roman Empire today. We see everything from the Colosseum to the Pantheon, let alone the Pont de Garde, let alone various buildings large and small, which celebrate the problem-solving of using cement and arches to create and move water or to accommodate the masses who are up for entertainment and pleasure during the time of the Romans. And we see many examples of Roman architectural excellence, from the Roman Forum in the upper left, next to it the Pantheon, and as well the interior of the Pantheon with its famous oculus. You recognize the Pantheon as looking like a Greek temple with its columns, with its capitals, with its pediment. But the dome is what makes this building so important and so different from previous examples in Western architecture. Remember, a Greek temple was largely an experience from the exterior. the interior space was not important. But now, for the first time in Western architecture, it's the interior space that is significant. You can also see the Colosseum in the lower left, an important building as we talked about for gladiatorial contests, but built upon that register of Doric, Ionic, Corinthian capitals as it rose from the lower level to those upper reaches, some 175 feet above the gladiatorial arena. The Ponte Guard, as well as the Arch of Titus, an important triumphal arch, all represent different examples of Roman grandeur in architecture. Another important person in the daily life of Rome is the sculptor, and we find his examples used not only in the capacity of funerary designs for the outside of a sarcophagus, for example, to various allegorical images that celebrate the glory and fecundity and wonderful aspects of Roman life. But we also see the sculptor being so important for delivering the propaganda for the emperor, demonstrating his role as this important figurehead. Here you see on the right an image of Augustus of Prima Porta, a commanding, larger-than-life, godlike figure with the head of Augustus, but yet the body that of a Greek god. No longer do we see the human anatomy and all the specifics of male anatomy. Now we see the Roman grandeur of a breastplate, of military might, stories of his military conquests told in relief along his breastplate. You also notice the small figure of Dionysus there at his feet, giving some sense of proportion, allowing us to see him as truly much larger than life. In considering daily life in Rome, we need to turn our attention to Pompeii in looking at what life was like in a regional, provincial city prior to the explosion of Mount Vesuvius in the year 79 AD. You remember this story from your childhood, and we're going to look at Pompeii through an adult lens and considering why it's valuable or important to an architectural historian, let alone an art historian, not to mention the anthropologist. First, let's turn to the role of the architectural historian in looking at the two images you see here. On the left is a reconstruction of the Temple of Apollo, and on the right, what that same view looks like today. Well, it's difficult to understand and appreciate how important Pompeii and nearby Herculaneum are for understanding what really is 400 years of different housing designs that were encapsulated by volcanic ash. First, the background. The eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD buried Pompeii and nearby Herculaneum. And for purposes of brevity, focusing here on Pompeii, let's take a moment to outline a few of the differences between these two adjacent cities. Pompeii was much larger, but Herculaneum was the much wealthier of the two cities. Pompeii was more downwind from Vesuvius, so experienced more devastation that first day. The powerful falling ash collapsing many of the roofs of the structures at Pompeii. Thus, few upper-story houses or buildings remain. Herculaneum was spared the worst of the initial ash on day 1. By day 2, had more gently falling ash and volcanic material, which blanketed the roofs but didn't collapse them. Thus, not only roofs at Herculaneum were spared, but preserved our beds, doors, and even food. But in both cities, the protection of different layers of Roman architectural history, sometimes again spanning 400 years of different architectural designs, has meant that the structures have been preserved from possible vandals over the course of all of those centuries since. We've looked at the architectural historian's view of Pompeii, but let's turn for a moment to the view of an art historian or an anthropologist. Here we see examples of richly decorated houses with murals and mosaics, a peek inside just what an everyday home might have looked like in such a Roman provincial city. Mosaics of Plato's Academy that you see on the far right celebrate learning associated with ancient Greek academic institutions. Let's turn to the image in the middle that shows a celebration of marine life in mosaic some 2,000 years ago. So long before the day of a scuba dive, we find the celebration of the octopus interacting with the squid and with fish, large and small. And what we know of this image and what we know of other murals and documentation from the walls of Pompeii, that there was a true celebration of life. We also find these valuable because not much of ancient Greek painting survives, other than on vases and different kinds of decorative vessels. So these murals and these mosaics give us an inkling of what ancient Greek painting may have looked like. I would also like to mention that many of the stories relate wild tales of debauchery, bacchanals, celebrating wine, women, and song. And some of these more ribald tales were far too rich in their imagery for our well-meaning schoolmarms and schoolmasters to share with impressionistic young minds during our school days. Having considered the historical context of how and why the Roman Empire was so vast and able to command such great areas of modern-day Europe and North Africa through her institutions and infrastructure projects, and having looked at the daily lives of so many different Romans, we of course must turn our attention to the triggers. What suggested things were going wrong, and perhaps lending some idea about why. In thinking about the end of the empire, we need to look in those years soon after the catastrophic event at Pompeii, when the Roman Empire would reach its peak. This map from around 117 AD shows the Roman Empire at its greatest extent, and you see it demarcated in dark red. Her well-equipped army, her advanced infrastructure, and for the most part stable politics meant conquering other lands came with great ease. It should be noted that the land occupied here in dark red covered some 2 million square miles. Not to mention the fact that the number of people under Rome's control is estimated at some 4 to 5 million people, or what may have been 1/5 of the world's population. We've talked about the strains, the pressures that were falling upon the Roman Empire, particularly in the 3rd and 4th centuries. But this map dramatically portrays the strains on the breadth and the range of the empire over a course of just 18 years. 306 is the yellow portion, embracing the Roman Empire all the way to that red portion on the right. But by 324, again 18 years later, we find only the red portion and that pinkish portion, part of the Roman Empire. Just when the empire fell is something open for scholarly debate. Was it the year 395 AD with the death of Theodosius I, or possibly 476 AD with Odoacer deposing Emperor Romulus? But regardless of a precise date, we can see how internal matters in the 4th century into the 5th century meant Rome was plagued with financial woes, and the cost of constant warfare was draining the coffers. And as the 4th century advanced to the 5th century, we find corruption and weak leadership rampant, and over a period of some 75 years, over 20 successive emperors. And as you see Constantine the Great in 2 images, in sculpture on the right and in mosaic, he will be the first Roman emperor to declare Christianity the official religion. And eventually the split of the Eastern Roman Empire with Constantinople as capital of the world of Byzantium, separate from the Western Roman Empire that would succumb eventually to those invading hordes and invaders from the north. We must devote some time to think about this legacy, about ancient Rome, the Roman Empire, and why it matters. Her extraordinary achievements that we've traced over the course of this lecture, over a course of 1,000 years, have seen such advances over earlier Etruscan and Greek accomplishments, allowing Rome to excel not only as builders and engineers, but as architects and sculptors. And we see by virtue of the roads and infrastructure, not just aqueducts and arches, but improvements in irrigation and sanitation, we find a quest for an advanced society that allowed Rome not only to prosper, but as well to conquer those areas far from Rome. Among the everyday legacies, Roman numerals that we all know on the outside of many civic buildings around the world, Latin words that will be used for legal and medical nomenclature, let alone the taxonomy of plant and animal species after Linnaeus started using Latin for identifying genus species. Remember also, Latin was the language of the Catholic Church and their masses for many centuries, only being phased out in the 1960s. The legacy of the Romans upon Western civilization is unquestionably in evidence all around us. In conclusion, I wish to return to our three well-known phrases. We know that all roads did indeed lead to Rome, and that undoubtedly one did do as the Romans when in Rome. But lastly, having looked at this extensive chronology over some 1,000 years, we can certainly appreciate the fact that Rome was not built in a day. Thank you very much. Hello, and welcome to another session with the Viking Resident Historian Program. If it's Tuesday, it must be Belgium. No. If it's Tuesday, it must be the Resident Historians Day on Viking.TV. I know many of you are familiar with what we do, those of you who have been on Viking Oceans, but those of you coming to us from Viking Rivers may not be familiar with the fact that we do have a resident historian on board each and every one of our 6 ships for all of our itineraries. And the beauty of this program is it allows the resident historian to offer maybe 2 or 3 iconic lectures that pull together, distill the essence of what it is about the history of a region or a place, or even a period of history that would be so important for appreciating the commentary from the local guides. So it's a tall order in maybe 45 or 50 minutes, as some of you may have just watched the lecture on the Romans and the Roman Empire. It's a tall order to do an entire university course in a matter of under an hour, but these are meant to be a springboard. These are springboards for further learning so that when you disembark and you go on one of our Viking excursions, you will be that much further ahead to ask intelligent questions of our local guides. And I've heard this over the years, by the way, from local guides. They frequently will mention how the Viking guests appear to be more informed, more curious, more interested in what they're seeing and why. So that's the essence of why Mr. Hagen created this wonderful program for Viking Oceans. I should also mention, by way of introduction, the fact that a little bit of a housekeeping matter. It turns out, I know many of you are busy, keeping busy at home. We're all trying to practice our self-isolation and do it dutifully as public health warriors. But what is interesting, I've read online that there are 2 things you are not supposed to do. Number 1, you're not supposed to call your ex-boyfriends, ex-girlfriends, ex-spouses. Stay strong. But number 2 is that you're not supposed to go online and watch YouTube videos on how to cut your hair. Not done. Well, turns out, I think it was Thursday of last week, maybe some of you saw on CNN, Anderson Cooper, you know, that white-haired chap who's on CNN International. He was interviewing Mark Zuckerberg and his wife, Priscilla Chan. And in the intro, she happened to mention that she had cut Mark Zuckerberg's hair. Well, Anderson, in his inimitable way, kind of did his boyish giggle and said, well, I cut my own hair, and then made this kind of quarter turn to reveal this bald patch on the side of his head. Well, this empowered me to think, you know, my hair's driving me nuts. I know I'm 65 years old. I should be blessed to having this much hair. But gardening was just a pain because it was in my eyes all the time. And so all the YouTube videos were about using clippers. I don't have clippers. So I just got my kitchen shears. I went into the bathroom without contact lenses or glasses. I just did it blindly, and I did kind of 5 cuts, made a mess all over the bathroom, but you know, not bad. James, our production guru in the UK, hadn't even noticed that I'd cut my hair. So I guess that is an acknowledgement. And the reason I'm telling you this is that have fun. It may be self-isolation. We're all going to get through this together. And, hair will always grow back. Who cares, right? Well, again, housekeeping matters out of the way. We're going to begin thinking about the Romans. And just by way of introduction, I thought I would bring in a wonderful quotation, which I could have shared from last week when some of you were writing in about, the nature of Rome taking on so many things that were Greek and inheriting so much of Greek civilization and putting their own stamp on it. It was the writer Horace who said, "Captive Greece conquered her savage victor." One more time. Captive Greece conquered her savage victor. And I think that encapsulates so much of what we were trying to relate in that legacy slide or portion of the Greek civilization in anticipation of today's lecture on the Roman Empire. We could talk about a whole bunch of things. I'll bring those in, but I wanted to get to some of your questions here right off the bat. Arthur in San Diego asks a really good, important question about, is there a difference between the Roman Empire and the Holy Roman Empire? Yes, indeed, Arthur. It is one of those major misnomers, if you will, in the entire history of history, if you will, that this period associated with Charlemagne and after, let's just call it the late 9th century, almost lasting 1,000 years, would predominate in more northern parts of Europe long after the fall of the Roman Empire. And Voltaire, the philosopher, had said there was nothing holy, there was nothing Roman, and there was nothing imperial about the Holy Roman Empire. But for our purposes, I'll just leave it right there. There's a wonderful book published by Oxford University Press, I would have said in probably 2015 or so, 1,000 pages in length, really giving one the thorough analysis of this rather amorphous body that controlled portions of, let's say, the Benelux countries in Germany for centuries, but yet, again, was there in the vacuum, if you will, before the rise of the imperial monarchies and powers. Turning to another question. This is from Jean in Denver, who writes, how was the presence of the gods different in daily life for the Romans as opposed to the Greeks? Good question. For those of you who watched or have been thinking about Greek mythology the last couple of weeks, remember the Greek myths were with the gods and goddesses and villains were really an important discourse for understanding about ethics and morals in society, judging right from wrong. And they were obviously taken so seriously by virtue of building these temples, these colossal edifices, if you will, as tributes to those sacred deities of different parts of Greece. Well, the Romans, remember that we have to remember this chronology, and I'll get back to that in a moment. The Romans will adopt various Greek myths, if you will, change the names to Roman names for those gods and goddesses. But the Romans, it didn't have the same kind of moral underpinning validity. They were sometimes seen more as kind of literary genius and kind of comic relief, if you will. They didn't really carry that serious underpinning that the Greeks ascribed to the lessons from those ancient myths. So again, that's probably the best way to explain it. But I alluded to chronology a moment ago, and I want to reinforce for you. I mean, I know that there are probably or possibly some school-age children watching as well. But for those of us who are adults, now with a grown adult timeline, really appreciate the fact that the Greeks were really living simultaneously with the Romans for a while before Rome overtook Greece. But as school children, I think we just thought everything was old. The pyramids, the Parthenon, the Colosseum, Notre Dame, the Taj Mahal, they're all just these old buildings. And without a personal chronology, we couldn't really appreciate the centuries, if not millennia, that separated some of these structures. And I just wanted to reinforce that here in thinking about this evolution and this chronology from ancient Greece to the period of the Roman kingdom's republic, let alone the imperial years. The fact that we're talking a course of 7-8 centuries for the development and the transfusion of ideas to be transposed, in the example here, with Greek to Roman mythology. Another one for you. Kelly in Omaha asks, are there aqueducts in use today? Yes, indeed. I think I mentioned in the lecture the fact that some of those Roman aqueducts still in use today provide water even for the Trevi Fountain, for example. So it is a really quite sheer genius. And if we think about plumbing needs and plumbers in contemporary life, can you imagine any of our guys, their equipment and, infrastructure ideas lasting for more than 2,000 years? It is quite remarkable. Let me just refresh my page here. And again, thinking about other aspects, other things that you brought up. This is one just came in from Peter in Winston-Salem. He asked, how did the Romans finance all the buildings in the imperial area, the areas of the empire? Did they tax the people or something else? Well, taxation was indeed one means of developing the funds. We have to remember also with the conquest of lands, that means the acquisition of laborers, and not to mention different kind of wealth, mineral wealth, tin, let alone other riches that could be part of the empire. But taxation will become a problem as the empire expands and grows. Well, I guess I could go into that right now. I'm thinking about, I once had a wonderful conversation with one of my Viking colleagues on board a ship, who we were talking about the fall of the Roman Empire. And he was under the belief or the sense that it was the Christians that were largely responsible for the fall of the Roman Empire. And I always find it, a unique challenge to field questions that deal with aspects of religious beliefs, because I don't want to step on toes, but in this instance, I was trying to enforce upon him a variety of different triggers that were instrumental in, over time, bringing down the Roman Empire. And I mentioned, for those of you interested in learning more, and I have a whole bunch of bibliographic references for you here, by the way, at the end of today's session. But on the history.com website, Evan Andrews has articulated what he believes are 8 reasons why the empire fell. And I'm just to give you a few, obviously, and I alluded to some of these in the lecture, invasions from the north, and not just the Goths and things, but it was finally the Visigoths with the sacking of Rome in 410 that left a real severe blow to kind of the ethos and as well the Roman mentality that had been slowly diluting over those centuries after, let's say, Hadrian in 119 AD. But there were also economic strains, and with this over-reliance on slaves. And I alluded to this a few minutes ago, with military expansion, territorial expansion, acquisition of more and more laborers to serve as slaves. This meant you had this ever-growing workforce to fuel the engine, if you will, but with military expansion depleting, and as well the problems associated with taxation to then make up for the lost revenue without added money coming from the outside. This meant an increasing wealth gap in Roman society. And so taxation problems did grow to be a problem, and lack of funds for not just building new infrastructure projects like what Peter was mentioning just there, but as well problems with maintaining infrastructure. I think that, and with the Vandals then coming in, overtaking North Africa in the 5th century, this again severely disrupted trade routes and things that were coming from the other side of the Mediterranean. So again, there were a variety of different economic strains that were taking place. But another factor which contributed to the fall of the Roman Empire was this division into two portions: that East Empire located in Byzantium, later Constantinople, Istanbul, but as well then the Western Empire located in Milan, and run out of Milan. And it would Diocletian, the emperor, thought that by this division one would have maybe some efficiencies and it was easier to manage because the empire had become so sprawling. But in reality, over time, it led to infighting, fighting over resources. And what is interesting in retrospect is that the Greek-speaking Byzantium was far more successful and skilled in terms of the administrative keeping things together, whereas the Latin-speaking Western Empire was further challenged as time went on. And ironically, the Eastern Empire thrived for almost 1,000 years. Byzantium before the arrival of the Ottomans in the 15th century. So again, this is all background about the expansion, about this huge empire, about administrative strains. But to get to this idea about empire and thinking about rise and fall, I think the next lecture that I'd love to write for Viking would be one of those given, let's say, on a sea day. But it's really about empires in context, about what aspects can one ascribe to the development of empires around the world, thinking about not just the Mongols, let alone the Persian Empire, the Russian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian before the British. You get the idea. What aspects allow power to be attained to such length and degree and scope? And then again, are there any threads that kind of suggest where things went wrong? And so many of the things I've been talking about here just the last few minutes, taxation, money for infrastructure projects, wealth gaps. These are things that we hear about in our contemporary world all the time. And again, just to reinforce as the historian why history matters, why we need to keep looking backwards to find relevance to solve our own problems and hopefully get some direction for a good course forward. But then turning to the Christianity issue, undoubtedly the waning popularity of, let's call them, Roman value systems were on the descendancy, while on the ascendancy was the promulgation of Christian values. And with that, Christianity being part of the proselytizing, getting converts, it was very seductive and very powerful. And again, as the Roman kind of old traditional ethos was on the way out, obviously the seduction and the power of Christianity, which was, really geared toward something individual and about an afterlife, quite separate from, let's say, the emperor as king, and it being all about, let's say, imperial or, governmental concerns. So Christianity, of course, has to be put into that lexicon of various reasons. But it was Edward Gibbon in his, classic 7-volume work from the 1770s, 1780s, that was really the promoter of this idea of Christianity being so figurative in the fall of the Roman Empire. But scholars generally really tend to stress more these economic, administrative, military factors, which then led to the fall. Well, thinking about, I'm just going to refresh my screen here. Thinking about women in ancient Rome. We talked about this briefly last time with Greek women, and the situation is not all that different. Once more, the emphasis was on women to serve roles in domestic capacity, sometimes being subservient or certainly obedient, if you will, as housekeepers to the male member of the household. Women couldn't generally inherit much, but if there was an inheritance involved, the male members of the family would oversee it. Divorce for wealthy women, especially during the imperial period, was possible, but yet her dowry or whatever she brought to the marriage would be guaranteed she could take out of the marriage after divorce. But again, in talking about this interface of Roman values with Christian ones in the late imperial period and after, it was increasingly difficult for divorces to take place under Christianity, and particularly difficult for women. But again, as I mentioned last time, history was largely written by men. And so we have these large gaps, which contemporary historians are continually trying to bring to life some of these people who would have been marginalized or deemed unimportant or lacking in contributions to the society as a whole. There were women in Rome, in the Roman Empire, who might work, but they tended to be, kind of administrative role, shopkeeper sort of roles, maybe midwives, these sorts of professions. But there are stories that come out beyond just those of Roman goddesses. Oftentimes, sometimes they're the wives of Roman emperors, or they may be special priestesses, these kind of people. But one story which did emerge was that of a poet by the name of Sulpicia. And I mentioned her, 1st century BC. She was the daughter of a known orator writer. So in the household, obviously it was stressed the importance of writing and learning and being taught by her father. But in a poem about falling in love, she wrote, "It is nice to go against the grain, as it's tiresome for a woman to constantly force her appearance to fit her reputation." And I say this kind of, could have been written by women in all over until the 19th century, if you will. It almost has echoes of Emily Dickinson or something. But again, it's this idea that women were possibly educated in the home and did have the possibility to learn things like drama or entertaining or kind of domestic, different kinds of skills if they were of a wealthy disposition and had women hired, enslaved in the household to do many of those kind of domestic tasks. Well, I think I should also mention another topic which I know some of you have alluded to here about the gladiators. And it is important to put it into context, the fact that this was such an important vehicle for entertaining the masses. But it should be said that scholars don't believe there was as much death, if you will, in the gladiatorial rings. That probably is a little bit accentuated by Hollywood. It's also should mention that, yes, there were women gladiators for a time, but not many. But thinking about the cruelty, and there's no other way to mention it, that one of the ancient writers talked about maybe 500 animals losing their lives over the course of a day's worth of entertainment. That is indeed cruel by our modern sensibilities, no question. But in reflecting upon this last night, I was thinking about how, in our modern society, in terms of the marketing, blood and guts sells. And it doesn't matter if we're talking about, video games that are extremely violent, what's it called? I forgot the name of it. Anyways, it's one about race car drivers and all of that. But thinking as well about Hollywood and the idea of resorting to gun violence and things, that stuff sells. And so in the real context of even thinking about the pugilistic aspects of the boxing ring, which is kind of, barbaric and cruel on the one hand. I just use this as an example of the fact that the Romans, not defending them, but in the Romans are really not that different from how we propose to be entertained with some of our contemporary media and events today. Well, I'm watching my time here, and I don't want to overstay my welcome, but I did want to give you a couple of other resources, things to be thinking about in terms of how one might continue to learn beyond these particular sessions. And what I've done is, first of all, I pulled together a recommendation about a wonderful series of books published by the Oxford University Press, and it's their very short introduction series. Now, these are paperbacks, and I did a little image, like, for example, very simple covers like this one, a paperback, and these are usually 150 to kind of, maybe 200 pages in length. This one happens to be written by Christopher Kelly on the Roman Empire, a professor of classics at Corpus Christi in Cambridge. And, they really do kind of what we're intending to do or trying to do in a short, concise, distilling manner to encapsulate what it is about the Roman Empire, within one small book. Here's another one on ancient Greece, for example, just to sort of show you the covers there when you're going online, finding these. This one by Paul Cartledge on ancient Greece, and he's a professor of Greek culture at Cambridge. So check those out. Those are really good. And their website is fantastic, not only for having additional reading lists and things to think about, but they also include a section at the bottom with kind of questions for discussion. So getting you thinking beyond what you're just reading within those pages. So again, Oxford University Press, their very short introduction series, highly recommend those. In terms of a biography of Julius Caesar, we haven't really talked about Caesar. I thought there were questions coming in about Caesar, but anyway, a wonderful one written in 2006 by Adrian Goldsworthy, published by Yale University Press, and that one's titled, it's about a Colossus, Caesar, Life of a Colossus is the actual title. And just to give you an idea, I just scribbled down one little quotation from his introduction, Goldsworthy's introduction, about Caesar. He played many roles, including a fugitive, prisoner, rising politician, army leader, legal advocate, rebel, dictator, perhaps even a god, as well as a husband, father, lover, and adulterer. Few fictional heroes have ever done as much as Julius Caesar. So again, this is a readable book meant for, general readers, but written by an academic. Again, very approachable for those of you wanting to get more into it. And remember, Caesar declaimed himself, essentially, emperor in perpetuity, only lasted 2 months before the assassination in 44 BC. But just to remember that of the 88 Roman emperors, only 22 died of natural causes. So again, something to think about. But anyway, that's a great source for learning more about Caesar. Now, this is kind of a little bit left over from last week, but I wanted you to be, for those of you interested in the history of medicine, fascinating subject, I brought in 2 journal articles which are very approachable and readable. This one is from the Centers for Disease Control website. It's the EID journal. It's called Emerging Infectious Diseases. Again, this sounds kind of wonky, but all you'd have to do, what I was recommending was an article called 2,500 Year Evolution of the Term Epidemic. And that's what it looks like on the website. And again, for those of you who might be watching this later, you can always just freeze frame this screen right here to scribble down the details. But Paul Martin is the lead author of that article, published in 2006, for those interested in learning about the evolution of this term epidemic. The other journal article, for those of you interested in the history of medicine, and again, I'm sorry to be a little bit wonky here, but I just know by amongst our Viking guests, there are many people interested in academic sources for information. Now, this one comes from the Journal of Preventative Medicine and Hygiene, and it's about the history and evolution of influenza control through vaccination. And this, again, that's what the page looks like when you pull it up online. I've used my yellow highlighter, but those who wish to freeze frame it right there can get those details. And that lead author is named Barbarus. Just again to get you thinking. But we're not done. For those of you wanting we all love travel. I think everyone, I probably could say this, every single person turning into Viking.TV is basically a Viking traveler at heart, wanting to learn more. Well, this is a fun book. This is called Route 66 AD on the Trail of Ancient Roman Tourists. You can see, I'll get the glare off there. We see a figure of Augustus of Prima Porta looking grand there, traveling with his camera around his neck. And this book, you can find, I don't believe it's still in print, but you can find it online easily, really tells about what the Romans did as tourists, where they went, what they were interested in, how you traveled from Rome to Ephesus, for example. And when I've lectured on this in the past, I always talk about the 3 S's about Ephesus, the sensuous, the sadistic, and the spiritual. It was the baths, it was the nightlife, it was as well the Temple of Artemis, one of the great wonders of the world that was at Ephesus. This book is really fun in terms of how most people in Rome spoke ancient Greek and Latin, so language wasn't a problem. They used different coins, gold or silver as currency, so you didn't have to worry about exchanging money. But anyway, it's a fun read for those of you who want to know what it was like to be a tourist or traveler some 2,000 years ago. And lastly, I just have to mention, by thinking about the nature of all what we're going through and trying to make sense of this idea of being a public health warrior, being kind of in self-quarantine. Don't forget to do things like what I'm going to do this afternoon. I thought to myself, how would Julia Child make French onion soup? So I have my rarely frazzled, overly loved Julia Child cookbook that I got from my local library ladies sale. And sure enough, on page 43 is Julia Child's recipe. And I thought this sentence was just so inimitable. You should therefore count on 2.5 hours, at least, from start to finish to make French onion soup. We've got the time to do these things. Be good to yourself. I'll make a whole bunch of extra servings, delivering to the little old libraries, little old ladies in my neighborhood. And, just kind of look after one another. Remember, we're all in this together. And next week, hopefully you can come back for another fun round of this, again, meant to be informal, conversational opportunity to learn about ancient history. But we're going to move to Venice and the Venetian Republic. And there we will talk a little bit more about the plague and about how Venetians dealt with a similar kind of scourge and fear around the corner. But I have an assignment for you before next time. I want you to delve into your memory about what it is about Venice that makes it special. And I know you can picture the lagoons and the exotic architecture, not to mention the gondoliers and their striped jerseys. But I want you to probe and think, without going online, without going to your libraries, what it is that made Venice so successful as a maritime powerhouse, and why her history and the course she charted was so different from other Italian cities. So that's your assignment for next time. And as I always tell you, don't forget to stay home, stay safe, stay fit. Don't forget to get in that Hippocratic walk for exercise, but also please stay in touch and hope to see you next time. Bye for now.